This week on Let's Meet Bread, we are making a very different and a very special loaf. This is called a Sally Lunn bun, or just Sally Lunn. It originates in the small English town of Bath in the year 1860. It was meant to be a complement to French brioche breads. It's made in this container. This is a tube pan. So you're going to need this for today's recipe if you don't have one. You can try making it in a regular bread pan or a regular bundt pan, but this is really what they recommend to make this in. Okay, so I've gone ahead and buttered mine up already. So just make sure you lube yours really well with butter or oil, because that way we make sure our bread doesn't stick. All right, and with that out of the way, I'm super excited to bake this bread. It's a batter bread, so you see we're not going to knead anything today. I have taken away our usual kneading board, so I'm very excited to do this. So let's get started. Hey everyone, first we are going to take our sugar. We have 1/3 cup of sugar here, and just pour this into a bowl. On top of that is going to go our yeast. We're using 1 packet or 2 1/4 teaspoons of active dry yeast. Next we have some water that's between 100 and 115 degrees Fahrenheit to put in there. Give that a quick mix around and then let it sit for about 5 minutes. Meanwhile, we are going to start preparing our other liquid ingredients. We have 1 stick of melted butter here. We have 1/2 cup of lukewarm milk, just about 80 degrees is about fine. And after that, we're going to put in a teaspoon of kosher salt. You know I always guess on the show. And we're going to give that a quick stir. And then we are going to set our timers for about 5 minutes and let our yeast mixture come to a rise. So I'm going to vanish, poof. All right, off I go. And it's been 5 minutes, and back I come. All right, so now we are going to take our yeast. Okay, thank you, Ben. We are going to take our yeast mixture and put it in our larger bowl, because we're going to start combining our ingredients first and foremost. Next, we're going to take our butter and milk mixture and pour that in. We're going to give that a quick stir before we add our next ingredients. We're going to take our eggs. We have 3 eggs here, and just pour them in. Give them a quick stir here to combine everything before we add our solid dry ingredients. All right, so we are adding a little bit of flour at a time. I've broken it down into about 4 sections. You can do as much as you want. You're starting with 3 1/2 cups of flour, and you can use up to 4. But the purpose of this is not to make a dough. The purpose is to make a batter. So as you're going through and doing this and mixing in your flour a little bit at a time, you want to make sure that you never really get to the doughy phase, but you want it thicker than waffle batter. So just keep mixing it. It will come together as a batter, and it will not be as dough-like. You can just see I'm scraping the spoon off here because it is quite sticky before we move on to our next step. All right, and take a look. Very clearly not runny, but not a dough either. All right, we are now going to cover and let rise. I have set my timer for an hour, but this is probably wrong. It's supposed to be risen until it's double in bulk. I would suggest doing so for at least 2 hours so that it can completely double in bulk. It'll be much helpful later. So disregard the hour timer for now. All right, so you can see that we have finished with our bread making. We have created a thick but workable batter. And now we are letting it rise in a bowl until doubled in bulk. I've set my timer for an hour like we usually do. And at this point, we are going to move into our politics segment. If you do not want to stay for the politics segment, that's okay. I'll see you in about an hour. If you do want to stay for the politics segment, just hang on 1 second and we'll be right back. All right, so before we get into our main segments, I have a correction to issue. I apologize. Last week, I spoke about 2 apartment fires in public housing, one in Philadelphia, and the other one I said was in Brooklyn. That is incorrect. The fire happened in the Bronx. I apologize. It was not Brooklyn. I apologize for glossing over that detail. I will do better in future. Before we get into our regular segments, there's something I want to talk about that's not going to make it into the regular section episode, so I guess it's special for the live or whatever. I want to talk about the attack on the synagogue in Texas and the aftermath. I don't want to talk about the incident. There was a hostage situation in a synagogue in Fort Worth. It was by a person who was crazed and believed all sorts of conspiracy theories about Jews, and I don't want to get into the details. What I want to talk about, and the thing that's upsetting me, and the reason I want to kind of just get this out, and the reason it's definitely not going into a segment, is I haven't prepared for this. This is very incoherent. This is just my personal emotions. Please let people grieve. Grieving doesn't always have to mean someone's died. Grieving can just mean that you're upset about something and you need time to process that thing. Jews are doing a lot of processing right now. And unless we reach out, you know, we don't really need everyone kind of coming in and talking about us or how we feel or what we're supposed to do or who our enemies are. Don't make this political, please. And I know I'm kind of talking about this late to the game because it's already been made political. Even shows that I like, and I think that they often take into account the emotions of people who they believe they're protecting with their commentary. It's not the time. Just let us have this, okay? It is difficult enough being a Jew in this country and knowing that there is lots of politics and conspiracies and other things around Jews and Judaism and being a Jew and whatever. And look, every Jew's going to deal with this differently. I'm speaking for myself, okay? I don't speak for anyone else except me. Please let us have this. Just don't make it about terrorism. Don't make it about Islam. Don't make it about Islamophobia. Don't make it about terrorism. Don't make it about the war on terror. Don't make it about Republicans or Democrats or war and peace or politics, anything. Please, just acknowledge that we are hurting. It's another incident in America where Jews have been attacked for no reason. Literally none. The Jews at that synagogue had nothing to do with what that person wanted in the hostage situation. They didn't have anything to do with it. Every other Jew in this country has nothing to do with it. We just want to go to our synagogues in peace. We just want to enjoy our religion, whether we're the most religious or the least religious, whether we practice at home or at shul. We just want to be Jews in peace. Please give us that. We're not political footballs. We're not political toys. We don't represent a group of people. We don't control everything. Just let us have our moment to grieve. Okay? Please. I know we're in a hyper-partisan era where every little thing seems like it needs to fit into a partisan narrative or a political narrative, or it has to fit into this larger story. It doesn't. Okay? This doesn't have to. Jews were attacked. They shouldn't have been. It was bad. The person has been killed. Whether that killing is right or wrong, I'm not here to discuss that right now. Please, if you go talking about this issue or other anti-Semitic issues or incidents, try and remember that the Jews that you are trying to protect or antagonizing or whatever it is, we're real people. Okay, we have emotions. We don't want to be a political football. We don't want to be a narrative. These attacks are hard for us. Just let us have that difficulty. Trust me, if we need help, if we want support, we will reach out. Okay? Let us have our trauma, please. It sucks, and I'm sad, and I'm upset, and I have lots of emotions about this. But please, unless Jews reach out and ask for your help as non-Jews, or even as fellow Jews, just let us have this. It's going to be hard, and maybe we will be okay, maybe we won't. But just let us be. Okay? Please. All right. So now that that's done, MLK Day was Monday. We celebrated the life of MLK. As usual, politicians that are not at all in favor of MLK's vision quoted him because that is the political zeitgeist thing to do. It's super disrespectful. People who don't believe in voting rights or economic rights or really in civil rights quoted MLK. Don't do that. If you don't believe in Dr. King's message, please shut the fuck up. No one wants to hear from you. Most people aren't looking to hear from you anyway. This includes corporations. This includes racists. This includes racist politicians, politicians that practice racial, racist policies. Just don't talk about MLK. He's not your guy. Okay, don't sanitize who he was. He was a radical. He wanted true economic change. He gave a speech about healthcare for everyone. He criticized the white moderate. Okay, if you don't believe in true economic equality in the way that Dr. King saw it, a fundamental restructuring of society past the capitalism that we experience today, shut up about MLK. We have not achieved MLK's economic vision, his economic dream. The Poor People's Campaign is ongoing. Shout out to Reverend William Barber, who continues the Poor People's Campaign for Dr. King. There are still people who are economically oppressed in this country. Workers are still economically oppressed in this country. Dr. King wanted to fight for them. He wanted health care for everyone. He wanted wealth to be redistributed to the poor and the middle class and taken away from the capitalists. He gave speeches about all these things. Dr. King, if he wasn't an outright socialist, talked a good socialist game. And if you don't believe in that economic message, and you don't believe in the economic and racial message that he was actually going for, truly being judged by the content of your character than by the color of your skin, truly having your economic worth be in a place where you are not being oppressed by a capitalist overclass, shut up about Dr. King. You don't believe in his vision. You just don't. Now, if you believe in parts of his vision, maybe we can have a conversation. But Dr. King's hope, his dream, was not to give Black people voting rights. That wasn't it. That's the part he got done, but that wasn't it. He led the Poor People's Campaign, as I said earlier. So there's a lot in that economic dream that we can still achieve. There is still opportunities for us to give healthcare to everyone. We could pass Medicare for all. We're not going to. We could, right? We could change the laws of this country so that the profits of corporations had to be shared with the workers, so that people weren't oppressed, that people have a living wage. MLK was talking more or less about, the FDR's economic deal, the new economic deal that he wanted to get passed, that he didn't get passed. Guaranteed job, guaranteed housing, guaranteed health care, good wages, time to spend with family. Dr. King was advocating a lot of that same stuff. And by the way, it's not impossible for us to do that. Paid sick leave and things like that. We have the ability to do it. There are people standing in the way, true, but we have the ability to do it. So this week, as we're honoring Dr. King's legacy, let us not just think about his racial equality vision, but also his economic equality vision. Realize that, truth be told, we haven't really achieved the zenith of each dream, and work to continue Dr. King's work by helping the poor and the needy in ways that produce lasting prosperity, not just a donation here or there, but changing the ownership of the means of production, changing the way that the economy creates haves and have-nots. And on the other hand, on the voting side, making sure that voting is easy and equal, everyone has it. Hell, the government could solve the problem of IDs by just giving everyone an ID as soon as they turn 18 to vote. Everyone's automatically registered at 18. You just get a card, you present the card, you vote. There are easy solutions to a lot of these problems. We just have to actually go forth and fight for them. Is race a good proxy for class, or vice versa? So the answer is no, but Actually, if you want a really good explainer as to why this really isn't the case, Jed Pan on the Jacobin show did a nice long explainer about how race and class don't really vibe with each other particularly well, and they leave people out. But one of the reason I wanted to talk about this, other than just kind of plug Jen Pan's description of this, which I think was really great, was not only is it not good, part of that not goodness is that the race class proxy is embedded in our minds. When you look at the way politicians talk about the poor, oftentimes they don't talk about the poor, they talk about minorities. Well, it's not always the case that minorities are poor, obviously, and it's not always the case that poor equals minority. This eliminates white people who are poor, but it also creates this kind of weird dichotomy between minorities or other racial minorities who are rich, right? And the thing that's interesting when we kind of lump race and class together, as well as kind of creating this strange balance where some people are counted as poor and some people aren't, just based on the color of the skin. The other thing is too is we start to create some level of solidarity between people who don't deserve it. So, for example, if you talk about minorities being poor, like all minorities being poor, then you're essentially saying a poor black woman and a rich black woman have more in common than a poor black woman and a poor white woman. But the truth of the matter is, as far as commonalities of one's general situation, a poor white woman and a poor black woman have a lot more in common than a poor black woman and a rich black woman. Now, are there social reasons, social policies that might benefit both the poor black woman and the rich black woman? Sure, absolutely. Not a problem at all. But as materialists, as people who think about these things through purely economic channel, as socialists, we need to think about our phrasing of these issues to talk about people in terms of their economic class and to create through our words, through our discourse, solidarity in terms of economics as opposed to social or race, right? Because that is the way that we create class consciousness, which ultimately gets us to where we want to be, which is the giving of the means of production to workers, right, and to non-capitalists. So, but this works on the other side too. You don't have to just use minority example, right? What does a poor white man and a rich white man have in common over a poor white man and a poor black man? Again, not that much. Sure, they share the color of their skin, and there might be social policies that might benefit them both. But truthfully, in one's general well-being, the two people who are poor are going to be the same. And by the way, the flip side of this is also true. Let's just take two rich examples. A rich white man and a rich black woman have way more in common than any of the combination of individuals I listed that being poor below. And by the way, there is already an ingrained class solidarity among the rich. You can see this in politics too, where people are going to vote very much in their own self-interest. And by the way, most of the people in Congress are rich anyway, right? They're not going to vote for things that you want. One, because they're bought, obviously, but two, because there's a great amount of solidarity amongst the rich, regardless of what you look like. So we who are not in the rich classes need to recognize that we lose out in terms of solidarity when we associate ourselves on racial lines toward people who are much better off or much different than us as far as economics goes. We need to make sure, in order to regain power from the upper classes, that regardless of what we look like, we solidarity with those people who materially share our situation, who are similar to us in economic class. Because if we don't do that, then we will forever be divided on these lines. And that, by the way, is what the capitalist class wants, is to divide us who are non-capitalists into a variety of different sects, religions, races, political parties, and such like that. Because if they don't, and we all come together and realize, hey, we have a lot more in common than we don't, then that's bad news for the capitalists who are suddenly put in the position of actually being the minority, right? If you think about it, the actual minority in this country and the world truly is the capitalist class. And if those of us in the majority, the non-capitalist, middle class, and working class, realized that that we actually have economic solidarity, we can use that power to oust the capitalist class. So um, there's a significant amount of pressure put on lower classes to associate in these ways. But what I'm saying is that we should look to our left and our right as opposed to looking up for our solidarity. Because truthfully, the only place the problem has ever been is if we look up, not to our left or our right. So another piece of news, kind of in the race, in kind of the racial angle here that I want to talk about. The federal government, Congress, has proposed a federal privacy law. However, it's a very limited federal privacy law. So essentially, what this would do is it would protect targeted classes of individuals. That's a term referencing the Voting Rights Act of 1965. Yes, of 1965, from advertising. So essentially, what this would do is that allowed to be targeted for your protected class status. So if you're a disabled individual, if you are Black or Latino, Latina, or a member of the Asian American Pacific Islander community, or for your religion, if you are a minority religion status. So those things used to be filters that you could use in online advertising spaces. Facebook is actually kind of where a lot of this happens to, to get a certain kind of person to see your ad. Now, there are upsides of this kind of targeted advertising, right? If you think about it, you could say that, hey, I'm just going to use an example that's close to home for me. Hey, I'm, a person who sells Judaica items, kind of Jewish religious objects. I want to target my ads to Jews. Okay, that makes perfect sense, right? You don't want to waste money buying an ad for people to see it who are not going to be interested in your your product based on who they are from a fundamental point of view, right? Totally makes sense. However, one of the things that's interesting, especially about Facebook, is that listings for rent and for renting and buying houses and other items could also be targeted in this way. And this obviously is a clear violation of the idea behind the Civil Rights Act, right? That you can't be discriminated against in housing or sales or stores or things. And now that stores are moving online and people are targeting their advertising, it's going to be impossible for you to see every store that's out there, right? And ads are going to want to reach you based on what they think you're going to want. But what we've seen is landlords might say, oh, I'm going to advertise to people between this age and this age who are white. Now, you could do that on these online platforms, but you can see how that'd be problematic and a clear violation of the law if you were ever to go to court for it, right? The whole point of, not the whole point, but one of the major points of the Civil Rights Act was to stop housing discrimination. And if you can just change your listing so that only white people see it, it's not that you won't take a Black applicant necessarily, but no Black applicant will see it. So therefore, you get the same effect, right? So makes sense. So this bill that has been advanced in Congress essentially would eliminate that kind of advertising. I'm genuinely interested to see what happens with it. The Senate is the place where any good idea goes to die, so I'm pretty convinced that this bill isn't going anywhere. But there aren't a ton of donors behind this, I don't think. So it'll be interesting to see what happens. It's entirely possible that there is actually a lobby pushing against this. If I had to guess, it's going to be like the Facebooks, the Craigslists, the Google AdSense of the world. I don't know for sure, though, what their problem with it would be, because people would still advertise on the platform. It's hard to say if there is a genuine effort to push back on this kind of legislation. But as someone who works in privacy myself, I thought this was a fascinating piece of news, and it would actually be really good. I mean, sure, it would hurt some businesses, like earlier, right? I said about the Judaica seller who wants to sell specific items to specific people, they may have to incur higher costs because they'll have to pay for more people to see the ad and they can't target it as easily. But in a lot more of the cases where there aren't such specific natures of things, you actually want more people to see these ads, as well as the law wants to protect people to allow them to see all types of ads for all types of things that they're interested in based on non-demographic information. So again, a very interesting bill. It's going to be interesting to see where it goes. I'm not sure where it's going to go. I hope it passes, actually. I think it would be a great advancement in our privacy and civil rights, to be honest, if we got a bill like this passed to stop this type of protected class targeted advertising. But who knows? If there's any follow-up on this bill, I'll certainly come back to it because I think our rights as consumers to know what's out there in the marketplace aren't often considered in Congress. So if we do get it, I think it'll be a really good thing. Obviously, some people will suffer, but so you can see I'm like a tiny bit conflicted on it. But overall, I think it's a good thing, and I really hope it passes. So I want to talk a little bit about the media, specifically mainstream media. And almost all the media that you see today on television, all television media, are corporations of some kind. And as we've discussed on the show before, the only purpose of a corporation is to make money. So, of a public corporation is to make money, right? If you have shareholders, you are legally obligated to create value for those shareholders. And if you don't create value for those shareholders will throw out your executive team via the board of directors, right? Because the board of directors have to be elected. So if they're able to do that, they're able to fundamentally steer the company. If profits aren't coming in all the time, then the incentives of the company are always to create more profit, right? So because of this, you have to, the media has to create revenue. And the way they create revenue is through advertising, right? So, you see on TV when you're watching CNN or MSNBC or Fox News, ads will come on between segments, right? And it's perfectly normal. Everyone's used to seeing ads. However, in order for that ad space to be there, someone has to pay money to the corporation to do that. So, and especially if this company wants lots of ads, and they're going to put a lot of money in. So, do you think that might alter the news coverage? Imagine you are, I don't know, say ExxonMobil, and you buy a bunch of media advertisements. Do you think the media is going to be critical of ExxonMobil and their stories? Probably not. I mean, if I was an ExxonMobil executive and I just given a bunch of money to a news organization and I was watching that news organization's channel and I see bad news coverage about ExxonMobil, I think I'd probably call them and say, we're no longer interested in advertising here, right? Because you don't want to advertise at a place that makes you look bad. So whether the hosts are thinking of themselves or the people who write the speeches or the executives, someone at the company is probably thinking about, well, we get advertisers from XYZ Corporation. We want to make sure that our coverage of things that involve them is either neutral or positive, because if it's negative, if it's explicitly negative, it's very likely that those corporations pull their money out. And if they pull their money out, you start to lose your profits. And of course, those people who are sitting at the top of the organization are very worried about their jobs, right? Because the board will just chuck them out if there's not enough profit coming in. So you can see that as long as you have this incentive, by the way, it's the same thing with money in politics, right? It's essentially the same thing as money in politics, but instead of changing the vote of a politician, it changes the coverage of the media. These advertisements, almost regardless of where they're coming from, bias media coverage. And they might do it in small ways, and they might do it in huge ways. But if you take money from a corporation and you continually and you're concerned about what that corporation might think of your coverage, you're definitely going to alter your coverage to make sure that the corporation doesn't think badly of your coverage, right? So one of the reasons that people, in my opinion, that people love independent media so much is because they kind of see through this, right? They see through the bullshit about corporate news. There's no incentive for most people who are making news or talking opinion on YouTube or anywhere else, myself included, to treat any of these genuinely bad corporations with any level of goodwill, because they don't pay us, right? We see things as we believe they are, and we tell them to you, our audience. This is why that independent media has really taken off, because, well, there's a lot of reasons, right? People aren't just people aren't watching TV anymore. Cable is dying, yada yada yada. There's actually a ton of reasons, but one of the main reasons, in my humble opinion, is because it's very obvious to people that the issues just aren't being covered in a way that's, well, fair, like objective, because those corporations are altering the way that they talk about these issues to fit the whims of their advertisers. Now, there are ways to get ad revenue and not have these issues come up as directly anyway. YouTube actually has a great way of doing this, or they had before they defunded most of news and politics, which was YouTube handles all the advertising as the platform, and they just sprinkle ads on random videos. They just an ad here, an ad there. You can kind of target it a little bit, but for the most part, you know, ads end up in categories of videos, and that's where the ad plays. And the partner, the YouTube partner, as in the YouTube creator, gets money from that, and the creator never has to talk to the advertiser. There's an intermediary there. Now, it's hard to know if a corporation could do this, right? Because a lot of this is more direct, but I have to assume it's possible. Now, mind you, with the reach these corporations have, and the fact that you're dealing with kind of individualized coverage, it might be more difficult to do that and create a third-party buffer in between. And even if that was the case, and it worked perfectly, and the host never had to talk to the advertiser, or the executives never had to talk to the advertiser, it's still entirely possible the advertiser would pull their advertising if they saw a negative story about them. So I think, it's much more difficult, I think, for corporate media to do that. But the real solution is to just not have a corporate media, to have all media be not for profit. So sure, money can come in and things like that, but either it's funded by independent pools of money at the state or federal level, or media is funded by subscribers, or it's funded in some other way that does not allow for the people at the heads of these organizations to be constantly thinking about, hey, if we cover this news story, are our biggest advertisers going to pull out, right? And by the way, we know that this affects businesses from a firsthand example, because if you look at some of the Fox News hosts that have been canceled, as it were, Sean Hannity, right? He had, or whatever. But the number one way that people get at these hosts is to call and tell them, hey, pull your advertisers, this person, or call the advertiser and say, hey, you should pull your ads from this show because they're saying these kinds of things and it's bad because associated with your brand. So this is also kind of, a social issues weapon, as it were. So there is some utility here from kind of a base, non-economic perspective, trying to change the way that things are covered. But if it can happen one way, it can happen the other way too, right? So all I guess I'm trying to get people to recognize is that anytime you have a corporate media like we have in the US, you're going to get these issues of bias, and you're going to get these coverage manipulations based on the advertising that's out there. I think there are solutions. I've listed them for you. But we're probably not going to have that in this country because there is a vested interest for a lot of these corporations in keeping these corporate media afloat, right? Especially because they're watched by so many people, for better or for worse. And they do essentially run cover for a lot of these corporations who are inherently bad by the nature of their business, or just by the nature of their existence. And by the way, for use as politicians too, right? Now, I don't know why that would be. I can speculate that perhaps the more do nothing politicians that corporate media defends, the less gets done and the less it actually rocks the boat, which gives the advertisers more money for them to pump into the system. That's all speculation. I don't have any proof of that. But you do have to admit it kind of makes sense, right? That would be some of the motivation there for kind of defending these do nothing politicians. So this segment's kind of gone on way too long, but essentially, bottom line, money in media changes the coverage. If you want coverage that is less biased, you need to actually find the funding sources of your media and evaluate them on that way. Oh, no, one last thing, mini rant here. So there is this organization, I do not know what they're called, but they create this giant list of media organizations based on truth versus opinion and left versus right. That chart is total bullshit. It's entirely wrong. One, it gets the left-right spectrum entirely backwards. And two, it does not account for the inherent corruption of corporate media. So what they're giving you is the truth that someone else wants you to know. Okay, that's not a conspiracy. I just demonstrated how it's true. So those things that come out, check your bias, news reporting, those are bullshit. Ignore them. Don't share them on Facebook. Don't talk about them with people. It's bullshit. They're pumped up. They are essentially doing the propagandistic work of corporations to get you to watch corporate media who are not going to criticize corporations. Sorry, is what it is. All right. I want to talk about the difference between a conspiracy theory and bad motivations. So, there are a lot of conspiracy theories out there. I'm not going to list them all because this video will get instantly flagged on YouTube and Facebook and possibly also Twitch for all of the conspiracy theories that I am aware exist in the world and could name. Okay, I'm not going to do that, but if you Google what is a conspiracy theory or most popular conspiracy theories in America, I'm sure you will find some. So I don't have to list them for you. A conspiracy theory, at its core, is that a group of people in a secretive fashion use the power that they have or some shady back dealings to effectuate a bad thing or what's perceived as a bad thing or just something, right? That's a conspiracy theory. Essentially, a group of people that are kind of unknown or unknowable or have some kind of bad intent or just some intent work together to make something happen, and they use their super shady backdealy powers to make that happen, right? That's conspiracy theory, right? There are lots of conspiracy theories out there. You'll figure it out. But I want to distinguish that from bad motivations. So what do I mean by that? So if I explain capitalism to you and the differences between capitalism and socialism, which I have lots of times, right? About creating wealth for the top versus creating wealth for the bottom, who owns the means of production, who rents and who buys labor, all those sorts of stuff, right? I've talked about this. So if I say that all the capitalists are working together to perpetuate this system, that sounds like a conspiracy theory, right? It sounds like this box that I've created over here, which is a group of people using their shady powers to accomplish a thing. But actually, it's not a conspiracy theory. It is what I would call bad motivation. So what is their motivation? So in the law, in public corporations, as I mentioned previously, there is a requirement that you produce money for shareholders. And the shareholders have some ability to check your power and privilege because they can elect your board and the board can fire the CEO, typically, or fire the executive team. They have the ability to do that. So shareholders get some level of ownership of the company. That's what a shareholder is. It's part owner of the company. So the company, its owners, the people who actually own the company and everything it's worth, have this power over the company to make it do things. And one of the reasons that shareholders invest in something is because they want a return on that investment. So they want the amount of money that they get from the investment to constantly increase. That's where profits come in, right? So profits then go to shareholders to make the shareholders happy so they continue to invest money in the company so the company can continue to do well. Okay? So the motivation then of the capitalist class, oft who either own companies or are the executives of these companies, CEOs, CFOs, and things of major companies, is to do anything they can to allow for profits to continue, whether that is reduce worker benefits, reduce worker hours, reduce worker pay, replace workers with machines, any one of these strategies that you as a worker are well aware of because it's happened to you or someone you know. But it's not a conspiracy. It's not that all the capitalists got into a room and had a discussion about something and figured it out and then executed it. We created bad motivations in the law. We created bad motivations in the way that we set up public companies. We created bad motivations in the way that we prop up companies that are failing because of their bad practices. We, as a country, as a world, actually, have continued to engage these types of engage in creating these bad motivations where the incentive is always towards more profits, more money, more exploitation. So it's not that these people are necessarily evil, although I would argue they are in some way, shape, or form. It's that their motivation is inherently bad and no one's changing it. And honestly, because a lot of these people are getting very rich in this system, they don't really have an incentive to change it either. So all the incentives are pointing towards this very bad thing. So it's bad motivation, but it's not a conspiracy theory. On the other hand, I'm sure you can think of things that are conspiracy theories. Then there are also some conspiracies that are more or less true, right? I mean, there are, I'm sure you can think of some, I'm blanking for some off the top of my head, but essentially what I'm trying to do here is I'm trying to point out that having conversations about groups of people who do bad things doesn't always make it a conspiracy theory. And the fact that bad things happen and it seems like there's small groups of people who orchestrate or benefit from those bad things don't mean that that's a conspiracy theory either. Sometimes it is and sometimes it's not, but we have to think critically about whether there is a conspiracy behind something, a small group who uses their power and influence to make something happen, or whether there are bad motivations, whether the system allows for these things to happen, right? Money in politics, it's not necessarily a conspiracy, it's just bad motivation, right? The military industrial complex going to war for no reason. Is it because a corrupt cabal of people essentially decided that they want to murder people for the sake of profits? Probably not. It's much more likely that the motivation is that they give money to politicians, so the politicians give them more money, and it's just a cycle of money where lots of people get rich, so all the motivations are in the wrong place. Capitalism, in general, is a system defined not by conspiracy theories, but by bad motivations. And when we talk about the ruling elite, or I don't want to use the words global cabal as my personal descriptor, but you've heard that term before, or the globalists without his obvious anti-Semitic components, there are groups of people who do not coordinate with each other explicitly, who create bad outcomes and have bad motivations. That's not a conspiracy theory. It's bad motivation. And what I'm trying to point out here and make sure that you understand is that there are ways to talk about these things that are non-conspiratorial, that allow people who are very skeptical of conspiracy theories, as I think most people should be, to engage with you on a way that helps us to identify who the quote-unquote villains are in our society without sounding like you're crazy and coming up with an explanation for these bad things that doesn't make sense or vibe with the actual reality of the situation. That's gonna make it in the thing. Okay. So this past week, we heard that there was an underwater volcano near an island called Tonga that is near Australia and New Zealand. There has been a lot that has happened as a result of that volcano. And one of the things that happened was a tsunami, right? So this volcano exploded underwater, which caused the land around it to shift. And because it's underwater, that sent waves out in a variety of directions. Those waves got very large. They created tsunamis. The tsunamis hurt lots of people and killed lots of people too. So first of all, my heart goes out to everyone who's been a victim of the Tonga volcano and its after effects, including the tsunami. The reason I'm talking about it is not just to offer my condolences to those people, although that is an important point, and we should do that. Luckily, there have been ships brought in from New Zealand and I believe Australia to help provide relief to these individuals. I really do hope that as many people who can be saved are saved. It's truly a tragedy. The reason I want to talk about this, though, is because one of the after effects of the Tonga volcano and tsunami was an oil rig, an oil spill occurred because the tsunami knocked a ship that was offloading oil from a rig. So the reason I want to talk about this is I want to take a climate change angle here. One, we shouldn't have oil rigs. Two, we shouldn't have oil tankers. Three, those things aside, we need to have ways that if we are going to continue this extraction, and unfortunately we're going to, we have to recognize that the Earth is an ever-changing place. There are dangerous things that happen on this Earth of ours. There are storms, volcanoes, there are tsunamis, there are tidal waves. There are all sorts of dangers that occur in the world that are very natural that we have slightly less to do with than the other terrible things that happen on this planet. If we are going to continue to do things that, if they break, they can hurt the environment, we then need to take precautions to make sure if those bad things happen, they don't hurt the environment. Guys, I think I talk about that on literally every show. We don't have a second planet. This is the only one. We don't get a choice. Once this one is toast for us, we all die. There's no planet B. And although Elon Musk and Jeff Bezos might think they're getting out of here, they're not either. If this planet goes, they go too. You know, it's not a particularly difficult concept. Obviously, the major solutions are just to get rid of sea-based drilling and other stuff too. But let's imagine that we're in our perfect world where we're using all renewables. Okay, sounds great. Some renewables involve tidal power and involve wind farms that are based at sea. So it is entirely possible that a wave of this size, and I heard it was huge, stories tall, that you could actually have this type of issue destroy coastal wind farms or overload a tidal power generation plant. So as we go about creating our green renewable system, we also need to make sure that it can endure the types of shocks that the Earth is going to bring all by its lonesome, even if there is no climate change. So I hope that the Tonga eruption has taught us a valuable lesson about how we collect energy at sea. My guess is it's not going to change too much in terms of oil rigs, who are notoriously vulnerable. I mean, just look at the BP oil spill. I mean, you know, it did not take much for that to do the damage that it did. And so if we don't create a situation where the infrastructure that we build can be somewhat resilient to the natural occurrences, one, it's going to cost us more in the long run, but two, we're going to damage this environment even further. And we just have to be so careful because we have done so much damage. Who knows how much oil has leaked out of this oil rig at this point? Has it been cleaned up? Has the cleanup process even started? I genuinely have no idea. But what I can say for certain is that The fact that the oil rig was damaged in such a way as to leak in the first place means that it was not protected enough from the natural ebbs and flows of Earth. Okay? If our infrastructure, we live in the modern age, there are ways to do this. We have to protect our infrastructure from earthquakes and tsunamis and volcanic eruptions to the extent that we can, right? There's no excuses anymore. It's not that we don't know how to do it. It would be different if we didn't, but we do. We have the means to do this. And I think a lot of this comes because I think private corporations are building a lot of this infrastructure and they're cutting corners. They're doing what's cheapest. It may be cheaper for them to forego the potential cost of repairs, or they might know that if there is an issue with repair, they'll just ask the government for money and the government will give them money. We need to take this out of the private sector to the extent that it's possible in all situations. The private sector cares about money. The public sector cares about the public. And we have to make sure that we care about the public and the environment when we are creating our current and our future sea-based infrastructure and land-based infrastructure. Essentially, if there's the possibility that some natural phenomenon can damage our infrastructure, we have to build it in a way that allows it to be resilient to that kind of damage. We don't get a choice. We have to do this. So the last issue I want to talk about today has to do with an issue that is pressing a lot in the news. I'm sure you've heard that there is a buildup of soldiers, Russian soldiers, tanks, artillery, and the like on the Russian border near Ukraine. I'm sure you've heard that there is continued fear that the Ukraine will be invaded by Russia. I'm sure you've heard Biden's statements on this. I want to talk about this, but I want to take a step back. Is it true that there has been some, Russian involvement in Ukraine in the past couple of years? Yeah, there is. I'm not denying that. I don't think that's questionable at all. I mean, Russia denies it, but I think it's very likely that they have been involved in some way. And even if they didn't send money, soldiers, or weapons, they didn't say no, right? I mean, so I think that Russia has some involvement in what's been going on in Ukraine the last couple of years. Again, also not what I'm here to talk about. What I want to talk about is the history concerning Russian aggression and Europe and their defensiveness, as it were. By the way, this references a discussion I had a while ago concerning NATO and why we should get rid of it. So if you missed that, it is on YouTube. Please give it a listen. It will inform the conversation that we're going to have right now. So, as you all know from my previous discussions, NATO is a hostile organization towards Russia. It always has been. It is likely always going to be. And Russia has their own local defense organization. I don't remember exactly what it's called. CETO. I don't remember the wording for it. But anyway, they have their own now. And Russia and Europe have been in a back and forth for a very long time. So it's true that Europe promised the Russians that there would be no further expansion of NATO in the direction of Russia, and that has obviously been a lie. NATO has been slowly and steadily expanding its membership eastward, much to the dismay of Russia, who sees NATO rightfully as a hostile organization. I don't even want to just talk about that. I want to go way, way back. Russia and Europe have actually had antagonistic relationships for hundreds of years, all the way back to Catherine the Great. So, by the way, part of this had to do with around the Industrial Revolution, Russia had access to a lot of raw resources that Europe wanted. It also had access to the northern sea routes. So things were a little different then because it was more difficult to get from east to west. But one of the reasons that the Suez Canal became so important to the British Empire was because they didn't want to have to deal with Russia and trying to go north to get to Asia. Whereas Russia, for limited portions throughout the year, was able to control a very valuable trade route that went north of Russia that could take you from Europe to Asia, right? And this was very valuable because for hundreds of years, Europeans have been trying to get spices, China, and other items from the East, right? The purpose of the Silk Road. Literally, this goes back hundreds and hundreds of years. But at the turn of the Industrial Revolution, Russia had access to two very important resources. They had huge deposits of coal, and they had tons and tons and tons of trees. And Russia was actually doing really well as an exporter of coal and lumber, but they were also using a lot of their resources internally to make the country a better place. One of the reasons Peter the Great is the Great and Catherine the Great is the Great is because they were able to successfully use the resources of the Russian state to create prosperity in Russia. And by the way, Russia at this point spans the entirety of its more or less modern borders. And the Russian Empire is all this. During that time and before World War I, the Britain and the US invaded Russia from the south in order to secure Russian resources. So there has been a back and forth going on between Russia and and Europe, now the EU, and America for a very long time. Now, the motivations for this have changed over the years, and Russia has altered its strategy for how it deals with Europe over the years. Some Russian rulers were content to try and trade with Europe and gain prosperity through mutual trade and understanding. Peter the Great is one of those. And some rulers looked at Europe and saw a group of hostile actors who wanted Russian resources and were not willing to allow Russia to share in that prosperity. And in some ways, they were very right about that. But as you advance onto the history between Europe and Russia, these angles have kind of bashed up against each other. First, it was wood, then it was coal, and then it was oil. Russia has access to the Crimean Mountains, and there are oil reserves there. Russia has been able to use those oil reserves to control some level of economic prosperity into Europe. But by the way, Russia didn't just come up with that position because they felt like being aggro at Europe one day, right? As I had mentioned, this antagonistic relationship literally goes back hundreds of years. And there has never been any sort of reparations or any sort of reconciliation between Russia and what we now call the West. And by the way, the West is a totally mythical concept, more or less anyway. But there hasn't been an active attempt to bring Russia into the fold for real. Countries ask Russia for things when they need them, but they're not about trying to maintain a happy long-term relationship with Russia. And actually, at this point, it might be too late because we have been antagonistic to Russia for so long. And the Cold War, by the way, was an absolute mess. The types of things that we did to Russia and the things that Russia did to us and the proxy wars that were fought and the creation of the Third World, which I explained on a previous show, but is essentially the part of the world that was not aligned to the Soviet Union or the United States. Proxy wars were fought there for control or proxy control of natural resources. There is lots of antagonism and lots of bad blood to go around, but these hostilities that Russia sees and has interpreted have come originally from the West. If there wasn't that original antagonism of Russia hundreds of years ago, and there was a real effort made to reconcile, to make peace, and to make one with Russia for long periods of time, then we likely wouldn't be in the situation we are today, because there would not need to be a NATO, because there would not be a general European and Western antagonism to anything Russia does. So coming back to the present for a moment, with that historical context in mind, and keeping in mind, by the way, the lie that was told about NATO's expansion, you can see why Russia might want to flex its muscle a little bit here. Now, I'm not suggesting that there's going to be a World War III. The stakes are too high. Both countries, many of the countries who would be involved in this fight have nuclear weapons, and I, for one, do not want to die in a nuclear winter apocalypse. And nor do most people. for that matter. But it is very, very important that we think about, it is very important that we remember as we listen to the speeches of our leaders and their leaders and the negotiators and all of that stuff and all those people, that we remember that there's a long history here, that these tensions didn't come out of nowhere, that the Russia wanting to create a barrier between itself and Europe isn't new. Russia has been doing this for hundreds of years because Russia does not feel that they are safe in their position. They feel that Europe is trying to encroach on what Russia believes is theirs, and they have tried as much as possible throughout their history to make sure that there is something in the way. During the Cold War, it was the Western Bloc. Before that, it was Poland and the Baltic states, right? There was always a barrier between Russia and Europe, and that allowed Russia to feel safe in its position vis-a-vis Europe. But now, if NATO is able to get countries that are literally on Russia's doorstep to join, there is no barrier anymore between Europe and Russia, which on paper doesn't seem like a bad thing, but when you're Russia and you feel that Europe is inherently and innately hostile to you, you've just taken away kind of one of the last safety blankets that you had against what appears to be a group of nations that is continually hostile to you. And by the way, with none of this commentary am I saying that Russia or NATO or Europe or anyone is right. I'm not deciding winners and losers here. I'm not saying who's right and wrong. What I'm telling you is that each group is very much playing towards their own particular interests. Russia is very nervous about the expansion of NATO and the EU as far as military things go. And Europe is very concerned about how Russia will act if they're not kept in check in some way, right? One of the reasons Europe wants all these nations to join NATO is because Europe is still afraid of a hostile Russia, just like Russia is afraid of a hostile Europe. And by the way, part of this is because of obviously hundreds of years of aggression, but also because they just have different and opposing interests. Some of those are economic, some of those are are social and political. But the point is, as we go forward and as this crisis unfolds, and I don't mince words here, it is a crisis and it's getting worse by the day, we also need to remember that each side has its own motivations and that this conflict is not new. It has been brewing for hundreds of years. There is still time to avoid it. There is still time to create peace. There is still time. But we have to give the opportunity for the Russian people to engage us, the West, as people, right? We need to think of them and both sides if you're not in either of those camps. I mean, I'm not in either camp personally. But we need to evaluate the situation, giving due weight and deference to each side, hearing out their arguments, understanding their motivations, and negotiating our way out of it. Because if we don't, it's going to get messy really fast.
So as you can see in my big reveal, which wasn't so much of a big reveal, the dough did not double in size. So an hour is clearly not going to cut it. As I mentioned earlier, you are probably going to need to do this for about 2 hours. Okay, once you've done that and the dough has doubled in size, you're going to take your wooden spoon and effectively beat the crap out of this dough for about a minute. So you're punching the air out of it effectively with this wooden spoon. So just tap the wooden spoon around the batter for about a minute. That's what it's recommended. Then what we're going to do is we're going to transfer this to the tube pan. So I am doing this with my wooden spoon primarily, with my bendable bench scraper as a backup. You can use whatever you need to do. You're going to need to use your wooden spoon to shape the batter into the correct shape for the tube pan, as it's going to kind of crowd to one side or another. Just take your time. It's going to take its whatever time it needs to move about. This is going to rise, it's going to expand, so it doesn't have to be the cleanest. You can see in a moment, I'm going to show you what mine looks like right before I rise it. And then the rise for this is probably going to be another hour or two. This is a very slow rising bread. Don't worry about that. It's going to be okay. It will be delicious when it comes out, but be patient with it. It needs a lot of time, okay? What we're going to do is we're going to rise this until it gets to the absolute top of the tube pan, and then we are going to preheat our oven to 375 degrees Fahrenheit, and we're going to cook it in our tube pan uncovered for 45 to 50 minutes, okay, until the bread is 205 degrees when measured with a thermometer, or it sounds hollow when knocked on. All right, guys, that is all for this week. I will see you next week. Take care, everyone. Bye for now. Thanks for watching this video, guys. If you liked it, throw a like on it, share with your friends, and subscribe for more of our content. You can also find all of our videos and clips on youtube.com. Just search Let Them Eat Bread and you'll find all of our content. Alright guys, see you next time. Bye for now.